On a cold Tuesday morning in October 2024, the crop insurance renewal meeting in rural South Dakota started at 8:10, and Travis Harmon arrived at 8:07 in a 1994 Ford F-250 with 312,000 miles, rust flaring above both rear wheel wells, and a tailgate that needed a shoulder bump to latch. He stepped out in a faded canvas coat with two-stitched elbows, brown gloves darkened from hydraulic oil, and boots cracked white with dried mud. 3 new diesel pickups sat near the front door, all polished, all financed, all under 5 years old. Inside, 32 farmers took coffee from a metal urn and studied policy packets printed with premium tables and yield history. Most of them knew Travis as the quiet wheat and corn operator who still ran a 1978 International Harvester, one 486, and a 1991 Combine, bought at bankruptcy auction, so they filed him mentally in the same category they always used. Capable, hardworking, probably undercapitalized, likely one bad season from trouble. Randy Pike, the county insurance agent, wore a pressed blue shirt with his agency logo embroidered over the pocket and boots that looked new enough to reflect fluorescent light. He moved through the room with the polished confidence of a man who could quote actuarial tables from memory and had sold enough protection packages to believe caution and leverage were the same thing. When he saw Travis take the last open folding chair near the back wall, he gave a half smile that read like concern and sounded like instruction. The room quieted when he began comparing coverage tiers. Then he said, loud enough for every row to hear, "Travis is the only farmer in this county who never filed a claim in 28 years, and luck runs out." A few men shifted in their seats. One laughed softly into his cup. Randy tapped the 85% revenue policy line with his pen and named the cost as if closing an argument. $71.40 per acre on corn, $39.10 on wheat. What none of them could see from a patched coat and an old truck was the underlying structure, the arithmetic that had been built quietly since 1997. Travis did not begin with money. He began with memory. In 1986, when he was 14, he stood with his father behind a wire fence and watched a neighbor named Carl Nessen lose 480 acres at a court-supervised auction after variable rate debt moved from 8.50% to 16.25% in less than 3 years. Carl had done what bankers and dealers called modernizing. He financed a combine, then a larger planter, then rented more ground to spread fixed costs. Corn fell from $3.08 to $2.19 per bushel. 2 thin harvests finished what rates had started. Travis never forgot Carl's wife holding the sale bill with both hands so it would not shake. By spring 1997, Travis was 25, renting 310 acres split between wheat and corn with an older machine line and a legal pad where he tracked every dollar in 3 columns: required, optional, deferred. Required costs got paid first and fast. Optional costs were challenged every season. Deferred costs waited unless they reduced risk more than they increased obligations. He received his first full crop insurance quote that year, read each page, and did not reject insurance as an idea. He rejected dependence. He calculated what his premium outlay would be and moved that same amount into a separate reserve account at the end of each quarter. In 1997, that reserve transfer was $24 per acre across 310 acres, $7,440 total. In 1998, acreage rose to 360, and his transfer moved to $27 per acre, $9,720. In 1999, 420 acres at $29, $12,180. He treated it as a non-negotiable expense, identical in discipline to seed and fuel. By the second week of April 2000, he added a second layer, 13-week Treasury bills laddered monthly, so one position matured every 4 weeks during growing season. That gave him liquidity without reaching for an operating line. The progression looked plain on paper and powerful over time. 2000, reserve balance $41,900. 2001, $63,400 after a hail-reduced yield year and no borrowing. 2002, $88,700. 2003, reserve draw of $36,000 to complete a cash purchase of 160 acres at $890 per acre. $142,400 total, closing costs included, then resumed deposits after harvest. He did not call it strategy in public. He called it sleeping at night. He also studied how debt changed behavior under pressure. Ben Kohler, a good operator and a careful agronomist, expanded faster in 2018 through rented ground and a larger revolving line because the land competition demanded speed. Maria and Nate Iverson financed machinery bundles to keep labor tight on larger acres because custom rates were climbing. Eli Stenson took on fixed equipment payments to avoid downtime and protect narrow weather windows. None of them were reckless. Each decision had logic in the moment. Travis saw that logic, and he saw the hidden trade-off. Loans made expansion easy in strong years and brittle in hard ones. He wanted the opposite, slower growth with fewer points of failure. Early discipline did not look heroic. It looked repetitive. It looked boring. He bought used equipment where depreciation had already done its work, then spent winter evenings rebuilding what mattered. At a 2009 bankruptcy auction, he bought the 1991 Combine for $22,400 with 3,980 separator hours, put in $11,600 across belts, bearings, and an engine top-end refresh, and ran it through 2024 with average annual repair cost of $8,940. New replacement quote in 2024 for similar class capacity came in at $486,000 before financing. He declined. In 2014, he rebuilt an older planter frame and meter system for $46,000 cash. Dealer package alternative was $312,000, financed over 7 years at 8.20%. A monthly payment near $4,900, and total repayment near $411,600. One path created pride in the parking lot. The other preserved options in a drought. He kept personal spending at levels many younger operators associated with struggle, even when acreage climbed. In 2024, with 2,140 acres in operation, his household budget remained near $38,400. Groceries and household goods, $8,760. Utilities and fuel for home, $6,180. Health expenses, $7,200 $40. Property tax on the house parcel, $3,100 $40. Clothing and work gear, $1,120. Truck maintenance and insurance, $4,960. Church and local giving, $3,000. Miscellaneous, $4,000. No vacation financing, no recreational loan, no side-by-side machine note. His farmhouse had a repaired roof, old windows, and a kitchen table with nicks from 3 decades of ledgers. Cash flow that might have gone toward lifestyle signaling went to reserves, land principal, and prepaid inputs when pricing made sense. In late August 2021, when operating rates were still near 4.25%, He could have borrowed cheaply and accelerated. He did not. By spring 2025, those same lines were pricing around 9.10%, and the math changed from manageable to punishing for anyone carrying large seasonal balances. On a $900,000 line, interest alone now pressed toward $81,900 before a single dollar of principal reduction. Fertilizer bookings stayed above $690 per ton. Diesel held stubbornly high. Basis widened in stressed delivery windows. Travis was not protected from weather or markets, but he was protected from fixed claims on tomorrow's harvest. Before we go any further, if you want to see what happened when that October warning met a freeze, then drought stress, then a foreclosure-heavy land auction, subscribe now and stay with the full record, because the next phase is where appearances and arithmetic finally collide in public. At the renewal meeting, Randy slid the policy form across the table and circled the signature line. Travis looked at the numbers, folded the packet once, and handed it back. "I will pass this year," he said. No speech, no challenge, just a decision built over 28 seasons. Around him, pens kept moving. Coverage elections were marked, and the room resumed its low conversation about volatility, protection, and scale. Outside, his old Ford started on the second turn, idled rough for 10 seconds, then settled. He drove back toward fields already showing the first hard signs of a season that would test every philosophy in the county. At 8:46, he turned into the Prairie Ridge Cooperative Yard to lock in fuel and dry fertilizer before noon pricing rolled. The Ford coughed once as he shut it down, and a pair of younger operators in new insulated jackets glanced at the rusted door seams, then back at their phones where financing calculators stayed open. Inside, the quote board listed urea at $702 per ton, potash at $648, and spring diesel contracted at $3.94 per gallon for March delivery. Travis set his cap on the counter and asked for cash terms on 62 tons of fertilizer blend and 11,000 gallons of dyed diesel. The clerk gave him the standard sheet first, 12-month operating plan at 9.35%, interest only until harvest, then principal due in one balloon payment. Total finance package, $171,860, expected interest near $16,068 if carried the full term. He slid the sheet back and asked for the paid in 10 days schedule. The clerk paused, then printed the discount table. 2% off fertilizer, 1 1/4% off fuel, no service charge. Revised total, $168,870. He wrote a check for $120,000 on the spot and scheduled the balance for wire transfer after afternoon grain settlement. One of the younger men watched the check clear the counter and said, quietly but not quietly enough, "I thought he was still scraping by." Travis heard him, folded his receipt, and said nothing. Randy Pike walked in 5 minutes later, pressed shirt, polished truck keys clipped to his belt, and gave Travis a look that mixed concern with impatience. "You are still refusing to spread risk," he said. "You keep acting like weather can be budgeted." Travis held the door for an elderly couple entering behind him and answered in 6 words. "Weather cannot. Obligations can." Randy shook his head as though it proved a point. Travis drove out, turned south toward his wheat ground, and by the time he reached the first section line, the stubble carried a brittle gray cast that did not belong in October. His philosophy had not come from stubborn pride. It came from arithmetic learned the hard way and then tested every season until it became habit. In 1994, 3 years before he started his reserve system, he made one financed mistake that he almost never mentioned. He signed for a newer used tractor at $38,500 with 9.75% interest over 5 years because the dealer promised lower downtime and better fuel efficiency. The monthly payment was $811. On paper, it looked manageable against projected net margins near $74 per acre across 280 acres. Then wet spring delays cut planting windows, basis widened, and his net margin dropped below $31 per acre. He made payments by delaying maintenance on his older equipment and carrying payables 30 to 60 days longer than he liked. He finished that year solvent and exhausted, then sold the financed tractor for $31,000, absorbed the loss, and wrote one line in his ledger: "Never let one machine hold next year hostage." From 1997 forward, the system tightened. He split wrist tools into 3 layers. Layer 1 was cash operating discipline, prepay only when discounts beat treasury yield, never prepay ego purchases, never commit to fixed monthly payments tied to optimistic yield assumptions. Layer 2 was the weather reserve funded at per-acre rates that tracked volatility. Layer 3 was liquidity timing through staggered treasury maturities and ensured cash accounts capped within coverage limits. The ledger sequence from those early years reads: plain and relentless. 1997, 310 acres. Reserve transfer $24 per acre. Total $7,440. Year-end reserve, $7,980, including interest. 1998, 360 acres, $27 per acre. Transfer $9,720. Year-end reserve, $18,430. 1999, 420 acres, $29 per acre. Transfer $12,180, reserve $31,260, 2000. Added monthly treasury ladder, reserve $41,900, 2001. Hail loss year, reserve used $14,600 for replant and drying, no line of credit. Year-end reserve $63,400. 2002, reserve $88,700. 2003, bought 160 acres at $890 per acre, $142,400 cash, with $36,000 reserve draw and post-harvest replenishment schedule. 2004, reserve rebuilt to $97,500. 2005, added 120 rented acres only after landlord accepted cash rent schedule aligned to harvest sales. 2006, reserve crossed $130,000 while machinery debt stayed zero. By the second week of November 2008, when neighbors were offered low teaser rates on larger operating lines, he ran a stress test at his kitchen table with a pencil and 3 grain price scenarios. At 4.5, zero corn and trend yield, leverage produced faster acreage growth. At 3.20 corn and a 12% yield miss, leverage consumed optionality and forced sales on bad basis days. At 2.90 corn with a 20% yield miss, leverage dictated decisions from outside his farm. He chose slower growth again. People often mistook that choice for fear. It was not fear. It was an operating preference formed by watching good farmers lose control of timing. Timing was the hidden variable he guarded most. Debt compressed timing. Cash expanded it. When prices were weak at harvest, he stored grain if carry and basis outlook justified it. When basis snapped tighter in winter, he sold in tranches, not in panic. In 2022, That timing discipline added a documented net lift of $3.41 per bushel across 186,000 bushels sold in phases, roughly $634,260 above straight harvest movement after storage and handling costs. Let me stop here and ask you something. If a strategy looks unfashionable, but survives both high-rate years and bad weather years, do you value appearance or resilience? If this kind of grounded financial breakdown is useful to you, stay with the record because the next numbers become even harder to ignore. His early discipline showed up most clearly in machinery decisions that embarrassed him socially and strengthened him financially. In January 2009, he attended the bankruptcy auction, where he bought the 1991 Combine for $22,400. 2 rows ahead of him, a dealer representative whispered that it would eat repairs alive. Travis spent $11,600 that winter on belts, feeder chain, concave adjustment components, and an engine top-end refresh. Total basis after repairs, $34,000. Through 2024, cumulative major and minor repairs averaged $8,940 a year. 15-year ownership and repair total through 2024 sat near $168,100 before fuel and labor. Comparable finance replacement purchased new in 2010 at around $280,000 and carried through typical depreciation and interest would have exceeded $390,000 in ownership cost by the same endpoint. The 1978 International Harvester, 1486, followed the same logic. He bought it used in 2001 for $14,200, put $4,300 into hydraulic seals and clutch work, and tracked every repair hour on index cards stored in a coffee tin. Between 2001 and 2024, he put roughly $72,500 into maintenance and component rebuilds, bringing lifetime costs to about $91,000 plus fuel. A modern financed equivalent with electronics packages and dealer service contracts would have required annual cash commitments that rivaled his entire household budget some years. He did not romanticize old iron. He simply understood depreciation curves. Household discipline reinforced farm discipline. In 2013, his annual personal spending was $34,260. In 2016, it was $36,110. In 2020, when many households expanded fixed costs during low-rate years, his spending was $37,040. In 2024, it settled at $38,400. That stability was not deprivation. It was design. The house was paid for. The truck was old and functional. Clothing was bought for wear life, not image. He replaced furnace components himself when he could, hired local trades when he could not, and never converted temporary revenue spikes into permanent personal obligations. By spring 2012, drought stress forced his largest reserve draw to that point, $118,000 for feed adjustments, irrigation support on contracted ground, and carry costs until better basis windows returned. He borrowed zero. By late 2013, reserve balances were restored through disciplined deposits and conservative grain marketing. In 2019, prevented planting conditions triggered another draw, $204,000. He replenished it in 14 months. The pattern repeated. Absorb shock, avoid emergency borrowing, rebuild. What looked from the road like small-time caution was, under the hood, anti-fragility built line by line. At county coffee counters that looked like old habits. At the bank, it looked like unusually clean statements. At auctions, it looked like patience, sometimes to the point of irritation for people who measured seriousness by how quickly someone bid. 3 days after that renewal meeting, he attended a dealer demo because a neighbor asked him to ride along. Randy was there with a producer group discussing integrated financing options and tax positioning. The featured planter package listed at $312,000, 7-year note, 8.20%, projected payment near $4,900 monthly. Randy argued scale required modern speed and data layers. Travis asked one question. "What is total repayment?" The salesperson answered, "Roughly $411,600 depending on fees and timing." Travis nodded once, thanked him, and drove home in the Ford. That evening, he pulled the file on the same planter strategy he had used in 2014. Parts, machining, and labor had totaled $46,000 cash, with no monthly obligation, no covenant, and no lien. For the 2024 cycle, he ordered routine wear parts and calibration work to keep that rebuild running another season. By the last week of October, the first freeze damage assessments were circulating, and then the deeper drought effects arrived exactly where root systems had already been weakened. County projections began sliding. Insured acres would generate claims for many operations, but claims would not erase accumulated interest or equipment notes. That distinction became the whole argument in one sentence. Payout helps yield loss, not structural fragility. Travis did not celebrate being right. He recalculated cash flow, tightened discretionary field passes, and prepared for a year when neighbors would need options more than opinions. Randy, to his credit, did not hide from the numbers even while he still pushed policy logic in public. He began citing Travis in meetings as an outlier, then as a warning, then as a question mark he could not dismiss. The county had not reached revelation yet. That would come at the Cooperative Budget Forum and the March auction, where balance sheets became public fact. But the shape of the truth was already visible to anyone willing to run full-cycle math instead of one-season comparisons. The patched coat and rusted truck were still the first thing people saw. The reserve balances, debt service ratios, and land titles were still the last thing they learned. The following Monday, the cooperative manager asked each operator to submit a 5-year cash flow history for the Winter Budget Forum, and Travis delivered a stapled packet that was thinner than most and far denser in consequence. It had no branding, no consultant letterhead, no color charts, just line items, transfer dates, maturity schedules, and notes in block handwriting that matched the steady pace of his decisions. The first page tracked reserve funding rates by acre from 2007 forward, because that was the period when most neighbors began using larger seasonal credit as normal practice. In 2007, he operated 860 acres and transferred $33 per acre, $28,380 total, while rolling treasury ladders at a weighted annual yield of 4.62%. In 2008, with 910 acres, he moved $35 per acre, $31,850, then reinvested maturities during late-year volatility, and still closed positive. In 2009, 980 acres, $37 per acre, $36,260, plus the combine purchase and rebuild already documented at $34,000 total basis. In 2010, 1,040 acres, $39 per acre, $40,560, no machinery note, no operating line. He never presented those numbers as ideology. He presented them as operating physics. When acres increased, reserve contributions increased first, not last. When commodity prices rose, he did not convert temporary margins into fixed monthly obligations. When prices softened, he did not need permission from a lender to wait for better basis. That dynamic looked conservative until someone compared full-cycle totals. The next ledger page read like a long-distance race split into ordinary miles. 2011, 1,120 acres, reserve transfer $42 per acre, $47,040, year-end reserve and laddered cash equivalents $412,700. 2012 drought, operated 1,160 acres, transferred $44 per acre, $51,040, drew $118,000 for crop stress costs and carry, closed year with $356,900 liquid and zero borrowed operating debt. 2013, rebuilt reserve to $489,300 through grain timing and deposit discipline. 2014, planter rebuild $46,000 cash. Reserve transfer $48 per acre on 1,240 acres, $59,520. Year-end liquid balance $552,100. 2015, purchased 200 acres at $1,950 per acre, $390,000 cash. Closing costs $9,800. Reserve ended $1,600 after replenishment plan. 2016, 1,360 operated acres. Transfer $52 per acre, $70,720. Sold old inventory in 3 tranches. Net price lift 67 cents per bushel over straight harvest sale. Reserve $612,400. By the first week of December 2017, he added a written rule that later looked prophetic: no new fixed obligation unless 2 consecutive years of below-trend yield and below-median price could still be serviced with a 1.30 working capital ratio. He tested every proposed expense against that threshold, including tools he wanted and did not buy. 2017 closed with 1,480 operated acres, reserve transfer $55 per acre, $81,400, liquid balance $703,900. 2018, 1,620 acres, transfer $58 per acre, $93,960, purchased 120 acres at $2,400 per acre, $288,000 cash. Reserve ended $700,000 to $41,200. 2019 prevented planting shock. Drew $204,000, transferred $60 per acre on 1,700 acres, $102,000. Closed year with $648,500 and a 14-month replenishment target he met. 2020, 1,840 acres, transfer $64 per acre, $117,760. No seasonal borrowing despite low-rate credit offers. Reserve $892,300. The arithmetic accelerated without changing personality. In 2021, he operated 1,920 acres, transferred $68 per acre, $130,560, and parked maturing Treasury proceeds into insured deposits as rate conditions shifted. In 2022, he ran 2,020 acres, transferred $72 per acre, $145,440, captured that documented $3.41 per bushel net lift on phased sales, and ended with liquid reserves above $1,230,000. In 2023, he reached 2,080 acres, transferred $77 per acre, $160,160. Purchased 140 acres at $3,900 per acre. $546,000 cash, paid from grain proceeds and matured ladders without touching emergency buffers. In 2024, 2,140 acres, transfer $82 per acre, $175,480, reserve and insured cash instruments at year end, $1,864,300. Same patched coat, same truck, same habit of declining any payment schedule that assumed perfect weather. The cooperative treasurer ran a side-by-side comparison against modeled peers operating similar acreage with customary financing packages. Annual operating line utilization between $650,000 and $1,100,000, machinery replacement on 5 to 7 year notes, and high coverage insurance premiums carried as recurring cash outflow. The cumulative difference from 1997 through 2024 came in near the figure later repeated across the county, an estimated $1,216,000 in avoided interest and premium burden relative to that leveraged median. Not because insurance was worthless, not because leverage never worked, because fixed obligations amplified bad years faster than gross revenue growth could offset. If you are learning something from this, pass it along to one person who still believes cash discipline is outdated, because this county was about to relearn that lesson the hard way. Ben Culler had not ignored risk. He had trusted a different framework. From 2018 through 2022, he expanded to protect scale economics, adding 640 rented acres at average cash rent of $286 per acre, then financing efficiency upgrades that promised lower labor hours and tighter planning windows. His variable operating line started near 4.60% and climbed with each renewal. By early 2025, the debt stack that looked manageable in low-rate seasons totaled $1,120,000. $740,000 operating balance at 9.10%, $380,000 equipment principal at blended 7.85%. Annual interest and scheduled payments crossed $154,000 before family living and taxes. Ben was a disciplined agronomist, but agronomy could not negotiate with compounding interest. Maria and Nate Iverson made choices many advisors called prudent at the time. They bundled machinery financing to standardize downtime risk and took a larger line to support input timing across expanded acres. Their combined package reached $2,470,000, with obligations spread across equipment notes, land-related commitments, and a revolving facility tied to commodity collateral. In strong production years, their throughput justified the structure. In stressed years, it trapped them in monthly decisions where every delay carried penalties. By the freeze and drought cycle, they were servicing obligations that demanded near-perfect execution across weather, basis, and yield. No one can guarantee that combination in South Dakota. Eli Stenson's case was the most painful because his fixed payment schedule was transparent from day one and still looked acceptable under trend assumptions. $14,880 per month in machinery payments, plus seasonal operating debt that reset higher as rates moved. Then came the 28% yield decline and basis penalties on top. He did not fail because he was careless. He failed because one adverse sequence hit a structure that had little room for sequence risk. He filed bankruptcy with the same dignity he had farmed with, and he kept showing up to help neighbors load grain even while attorneys sorted his own accounts. People in the county respected that, including Travis. Randy Pike kept arguing that claims would cushion the storm, and he was right within limits. Policies paid uncovered losses. Checks arrived. But those checks entered balance sheets already loaded with fixed claims from lenders and equipment contracts. Insurance softened yield shocks. It did not erase accumulated leverage. That was the fracture line running through every coffee conversation by late winter. By mid-December 2024, elevator bids weakened again as freight and basis pressure widened, and operating notes reset for spring planning at rates many had not budgeted 12 months earlier. Fertilizer stayed above $690 per ton. Chemical programs rose between 8 and 14%, depending on trait packages and timing. Cash rent did not fall as quickly as margins. The county's average break-even per corn acre moved upward while projected selling prices moved sideways. Travis faced the same board prices, the same dry topsoil profile, and the same winter input calls. What he did not face was mandatory monthly debt service linked to optimistic yield projections. He made 3 moves in January that looked modest and were decisive. First, he matured a section of short-duration Treasury holdings and set aside $312,000 strictly for 2025 input commitments, ring-fenced from land opportunities. Second, he negotiated early pay terms with 2 suppliers and reduced booked cost by a documented $7,940 versus finance terms. Third, he wrote reserve rules into his lease contracts. No expansion acre, unless first-year reserve contribution, was prepaid at signing. He was not predicting a disaster. He was refusing to be surprised by one. The weather did the rest. Freeze damage from late October reduced stand potential on vulnerable fields. Then winter moisture underperformed, and spring profile recharge lagged. County agronomy reports by March 2025 showed stress compounding in the exact zones where thin margins had already compressed decision space. Operators carrying high obligations trimmed passes, delayed applications, or accepted suboptimal timing because cash had become a scheduling constraint. Travis adjusted too, but from a different base. He reduced discretionary passes early, protected highest return fertility zones, and kept enough liquidity to avoid forced grain movement into weak basis windows. He drew from reserve when needed, and recorded each draw against replenishment targets instead of against bank covenants. By the second week of February, 2025, Ben surrendered 640 rented acres he could no longer justify under revised cost and interest assumptions. It was not loud, no public confrontation, just paperwork, hard phone calls, and a quiet conversation at the cooperative office where he said he needed a structure he could survive, not one that looked good in presentations. Maria and Nate listed most of their machinery line for auction to satisfy creditor requirements and preserve a core operating footprint. Eli finalized bankruptcy filings after failing to renegotiate payment schedules that had no flexibility left. 3 good operations, 3 different paths, 1 shared exposure to fixed obligations during a multi-shock cycle. Travis remained standing not because he avoided pain, but because pain did not trigger automatic claims on future harvest. His balance sheet absorbed weather stress the way his ledger was built to absorb it. Reserve draw, cost triage, patient sales, no panic borrowing. When lenders began repossession proceedings on larger tracts across the county, he did not celebrate. He asked for title packets, soil maps, and drainage history. He ran numbers at his kitchen table under a yellow light that had illuminated 3 decades of the same method. Outside, the 1994 Ford sat in the dark with rust along the fenders and frost on the windshield. Inside, line by line, he prepared for the auction that would force the whole county to distinguish between looking solvent and being solvent. The auction notice went live at 9 o'clock the next morning on the county board in Brookings, and by noon 3 lenders had posted full legal descriptions for the repossessed tracts. Parcel A, 640 contiguous acres with mixed Class 2 and 3 soils. Parcel B, 220 acres with better drainage and higher historic corn averages. Parcel C, 160 acres of lighter ground that had changed hands twice in 6 years. Travis took copies home, marked drainage patterns in pencil, and wrote 2 numbers at the top of the page: bid ceiling and liquidity floor. He would not cross either line. By the first Thursday of March 2025, the foreclosure auction room was full 40 minutes before start time. Randy Pike stood near the front with 2 producer clients and a legal pad, speaking in low, efficient sentences about debt restructuring, claim timing, and bridge financing. When he saw Travis enter in the same faded coat and sit along the side wall without a folder, he gave a brief nod that carried skepticism and habit in equal measure. The room read Travis the way it always had: useful at auctions for used parts, not likely to compete once land moved above local cash ranges. The auctioneer opened Parcel A at $3,900 per acre, and the room moved quickly. Bids climbed in $50 jumps, then $100 jumps, then slowed near $4,700 as lender-approved caps began to show. Travis did not speak until $4,800. He raised 2 fingers. Another bidder answered at $4,825. Travis said $4,850, then looked down at his sheet and put his pen away. No one topped it. Hammer down. Parcel A sold at $4,850 per acre. Total $3,104,000. Parcel B opened at $4,200 and rose faster than anyone expected, driven by drainage quality and highway access. A partnership from 2 counties over pushed to $4,575. Travis entered once at $4,600 and stopped the room again. Hammer down at $4,600 per acre. Total $1,012,000. On Parcel C, he did not bid at all. A younger operator won it at $4,350 per acre with lender support. And Travis stayed still, eyes on his own notes, because preserving liquidity had been part of the plan from the first line. At settlement, the title company expected staged funding through escrow windows. Instead, Travis handed over proof of funds letters from 2 institutions and authorized same-day wires. Purchase price on A and B came to $4,116,000. Closing, recording, and transfer costs added $2,000. Total wired by 3:42 that afternoon, $4,118,000. The title clerk, who had prepared fallback language for delayed performance, refreshed her screen twice before printing confirmation. Randy watched from 10 feet away while the confirmations came through. His expression did not break into shock or anger. It settled into the quieter look of a man recalculating in real time. One of his clients asked softly, "How is he doing this in one day?" Randy answered with unusual restraint. "Clean balance sheet, long memory." The true scale became public an hour later when the county board requested ownership, affidavits, and debt declarations for concentration review. Travis submitted an audited statement prepared for tax and estate planning in January 2025. Total net worth, $12,740,000. Land holdings at appraised value, $9,860,000 after the auction transfer update. Grain inventory marked to conservative bid levels, $1,015,700. Reserve and insured liquidity instruments, $1,864,300. Machinery and buildings after depreciation schedules, $0. He carried no operating note and no machinery lien. In a room where people had long measured financial strength by new paint and monthly throughput, the numbers reset the hierarchy without a single speech. 4 days later, he called Ben Kohler first. Ben answered on the second ring from a service truck parked outside a rented shed. Travis asked one question. "Can you meet tonight?" They sat at Travis's kitchen table under the same yellow light that had seen 3 decades of ledgers. Ben arrived with a notebook, 2 years of cost sheets, and the posture of a man prepared to accept less than he wanted if it meant he could keep farming at all. Travis slid a 1-page term sheet across the table. 480 acres from Parcel A. 5-year lease-to-own structure. Land basis $4,800 to $50 per acre. Principal benchmark $2,328,000. Interest at 3.00% simple. No compounding penalties. First-year payment deferred in full. Years 2 through 5 paid after harvest in 4 scheduled installments with prepayment allowed at any time without fee. Mandatory reserve contribution, $35 per acre per year, deposited quarterly into a restricted account in Ben's name. Miss a reserve deposit twice, and acreage steps down until compliance returns. Ben read the page twice, then stopped at the reserve line. "I can make the land payment," he said. "The reserve is the hard part." "That is why it is there," Travis answered. Ben signed at 10:14 that night. Travis countersigned. No lawyers in the room, but documents were filed by counsel the next morning. 3 days passed before Maria and Nate Iverson came over. They did not come together with polished optimism. They came with folders from creditors, auction statements, and a fatigue that had no theatrical element. Travis offered 300 acres from Parcel B under the same 5-year lease-to-own framework, adjusted to their crop mix and cash flow cycle. Basis $4,600 per acre. Principal benchmark $1,380,000. Interest 3.00% simple. First-year payment deferred. Years 2 through 5 on post-harvest schedule. Mandatory reserve contribution, $35 per acre, which set their annual reserve target at $10,500 before any discretionary spending or equipment upgrades. Additional covenant. No machinery financing above $40,000 outstanding without written stress test review. Nate looked at the covenant and exhaled. That rule would have made us angry 2 years ago. Maria kept her hand on the page and said, "Now it looks like oxygen." They signed with their attorney present by video. Recording fees were paid by Travis, not capitalized into their note. Eli Stenson came last, just after sunrise 2 mornings later, carrying bankruptcy discharge documents in a weatherproof envelope. Travis had set aside 80 acres from Parcel A for him. Lighter soils suited to lower input rotation strategies Eli had started testing before his collapse. Basis $4,850 per acre. Principal benchmark $388,000. Same 3.00% simple interest. Same $35 per acre reserve requirement. Annual target $2,800. But Eli's agreement included one additional term Travis wrote in by hand. Input intensity cap tied to projected margin floors, reviewed each January. Eli read it and nodded once. "You are making me farm slower." "I am making you last," Travis said. Within 10 days of the auction, all 860 acres he had purchased were under structured agreements designed to rebuild operators, not just transfer control. On paper, he could have captured far higher returns by leasing at prevailing market rates without purchase options. He chose lower yield on capital in exchange for higher durability in people. That choice was the core of his philosophy made visible. The point of a strong balance sheet was optionality. An optionality used only for self-protection remained unfinished work. At the cooperative office, the accounting staff asked for permission to model the contracts for educational use at the Spring Risk Forum. Travis agreed if recipient names were included, because he did not want anonymous case studies that made failure look abstract. The resulting packet became the clearest financial decomposition the county had seen. Ben's schedule showed projected annual gross revenue on 480 acres under conservative yields and prices at $566,400. Variable and fixed operating costs at $418,900, land payment accrual at $159,180 in paid years, and reserve requirement $16,800. In payment years, that left thin but positive coverage if basis stayed within modeled bands. In the deferred first year, cash that would have gone to debt service instead rebuilt working capital and prepaid key inputs at discount windows, reducing carry cost by an estimated $11,200. Maria and Nate's 300-acre plan projected gross revenue $363,000 under conservative assumptions, operating costs $262,400 after machinery downsizing, land payment accrual in paid years $94,185, reserve requirement $10,500. Their decisive gain did not come from yield miracles. It came from removing high-interest machinery obligations that had consumed timing and judgment. With those notes gone, they could market grain in tranches again rather than selling on lender calendars. Eli's 80-acre model looked small and, in context, strategic. Projected gross revenue, $88,000 under lower input rotation, operating cost $57,600, land payment accrual in paid years, $26,460, reserve requirement $2,800. Narrow margins remained, but the structure removed the monthly payment pressure that had broken him. His plan also included off-farm winter income that stayed outside collateral covenants. The cooperative treasurer then ran a comparison all the way back through Travis's own records to show why he could fund these terms. Total reserve contributions from 1997 through 2024, $2,006,190. Total document reserve draws for weather and timing stress, $356,600. Net contributed capital after draws, $1,649,590. Interest and yield earnings across ladders and insured deposits over that span, $614,710. Ending liquid balance, January 2025, $1,864,300 after reallocations. Avoided premium and interest burden versus leveraged median, $1,216,000 cumulative. Land purchased in cash over multiple cycles at below later market values created additional embedded equity that did not appear until appraisal day. The arithmetic was not elegant in one season. It was relentless across 28. At the April County Board meeting, Randy Pike requested time on record. He did not defend his earlier certainty. He revised it. Claims are useful tools, he said. But tools cannot fix structures that break under debt service stress. Harmon's model outperformed every leverage plan I sold in this zip code during this cycle. He then proposed a new agency protocol requiring cash flow stress testing at 2 adverse yield and price scenarios before recommending high coverage tiers with large financed input packages. The board adopted the recommendation for advisory use. That same evening, Travis drove home in the 1994 Ford, mud still caked along the rocker panels, auction title copies in a manila folder on the seat beside him. At a stop sign 2 miles from his place, he wrote one note on the edge of the folder at 6:18 in fading light. Reserve rules are now community rules if they survive 3 seasons. He underlined survive once, then turned toward the farmyard where the 1978 International sat near the shed, and the old combine waited for another year that would test everyone again, this time with more of them carrying structure, built to endure rather than appearance built to impress. He parked beside the machine shed, carried the manila folder into the kitchen, and copied the auction wires and signed contracts into the same ledger system that had started as 3 columns in 1997. Required, optional, deferred. Then he added a 4th column for the 3 operators now tied to his land under terms that were strict for one reason only. The structure had to outlive 1 favorable season. By the end of that week, each contract had a matching reserve account number, quarterly deposit dates, and default language that stepped acreage down before it collapsed to family. By the 3rd week of April 2025, spring work was underway, and the first test was not weather. It was behavior under less pressure. Ben Kohler ran 480 acres under his new agreement and kept the old habit that had made him good before leverage made him brittle. He sampled, measured, and adjusted instead of chasing heroic yield assumptions. His deferred first-year land payment left $159,180 in his operating account that would otherwise have left the farm, and he used it in the exact order Travis required in writing. Prepaid core fertilizer on discount, funded full reserve contributions, then held the remainder as working capital. His reserve obligation was $16,800 for the year, paid in 4 equal deposits of $4,200. He made each deposit on schedule. At year-end, his current assets and near-cash grain exceeded current liabilities by enough to move his working capital ratio back above 1. By the close of 2026, audited cooperative records showed him at 1.42. Maria and Nate Iverson had a different challenge. Their operation had been built around speed and monthly notes, so the silence after machinery debt went to 0 felt unfamiliar before it felt safe. They ran 300 acres with lower fixed cost, restored their maintenance schedule on owned equipment, and stopped selling grain on lender calendars. In their first season, under Travis's terms, they set aside the required $10,500 reserve contribution and still finished with positive retained earnings because they captured better basis windows on stage sales. In the second season, they repeated the reserve deposits and paid down remaining non-machinery obligations faster than their model required. By the end of 2026, their machinery debt stood at 0, exactly as the term sheet had been designed to force. Eli Stenson's trajectory was slower and in some ways the clearest proof that structure matters more than image. 80 acres would not erase a bankruptcy record, and no one pretended it would. He shifted to lower input rotations with explicit margin floors, held his annual reserve target at $2,800, and kept off-farm winter income ring-fenced from operating risk. His first year closed with a modest surplus. His second year closed with a larger one, not because prices turned magical, but because his cost base no longer depended on making every month perfect. 2 consecutive profitable years followed the ugliest financial chapter of his life, and the county noticed. If you want to know whether those outcomes came from one generous man or from a replicable framework, subscribe and stay through the final record, because this is where the multiplier becomes measurable. The multiplier began with a simple mandatory number that had annoyed every recipient at first: $35 per acre into reserve, no exceptions. Across Ben, the Iversons, and Eli, that covered 860 acres and produced $30,100 in annual reserve deposits. 1 year gave them a cushion. 2 years gave them options. 3 years, which was the threshold note Travis had written on the folder edge, changed how they negotiated inputs and timing. Suppliers offered better terms to operators who could pay in discount windows. Landlords took calls from farmers who could absorb weather variance without emergency refinancing. Risk did not vanish. It became priced, planned, and survivable. By harvest 2026, the cooperative forum that had once treated Travis as an outlier began publishing stress test templates modeled on his rules. Required reserves were entered before projected upgrades. Payment schedules were evaluated against 2 adverse scenarios, not one. The county did not become debt-free. It became less casual about debt. That difference saved acreage. The next move was larger than any single lease-to-own contract. In January 2027, Travis executed endowment documents for the Harmon Field Reserve Fund and transferred $2,500,000 in cash and short-duration instruments into a governed structure with one narrow mandate: zero-interest emergency notes up to $75,000 for first-generation farmers who completed cash flow stress tests and committed to quarterly reserve deposits. No ceremonial launch, no banquet, just recorded paperwork, advisory oversight, and lending criteria written in plain language. Over the first 18 months, the fund approved 12 operations. Total notes issued reached $684,000, with individual amounts ranging from $28,000 to $75,000 based on acreage and cost structure. Every note carried the same behavioral covenant. Travis had imposed on Ben, Maria, and Nate, and Eli. Reserve contribution first, expansion second. Repayment performance stayed perfect through that initial window, with a 100% on-time rate and no restructuring requests. The practical outcome was not abstract charity. It was 3,760 acres retained in family production that would likely have transferred under distress terms. Let me stop here and ask you something. When people say discipline is outdated, are they comparing it to thoughtful risk models or to easy credit in good years? Write your answer in the comments, because this county learned the difference with real land on the line. Randy Pike's resolution came without theater and without erasure. He remained in his role, kept selling coverage, and revised his advisory process in public view. After the April board statement, he added mandatory debt service stress tables to every high-coverage recommendation packet his office produced. He began telling younger agents that insurance can absorb a yield event, but cannot rescue a structurally fragile balance sheet loaded with fixed claims. The line he had once used to pressure Travis disappeared from his presentations, replaced by a new one that sounded less polished and more accurate. Protection works best when obligations are survivable first. In 2026 and 2027, he hosted winter workshops with the cooperative where claim mechanics were taught alongside cash flow resilience. He still believed in coverage. He stopped presenting leverage as proof of professionalism. Operators who had once viewed him as a salesman began treating him as a technician again. He did not become Travis's friend in any sentimental sense, but he became an unlikely ally in one concrete way. he started recommending lower-cost coverage tiers when reserves and debt service models justified them, instead of defaulting to highest premium plans. He retired in 2028 at a county meeting where he spoke plainly about his own reversal. He said he had spent years optimizing policy elections while underweighting debt timing risk, and he said Travis forced him to confront that blind spot with numbers he could not dismiss. There was no humiliation arc, no applause line engineered for drama, just a professional correction made on record, then carried into the training of younger agents who would advise the next cycle of farmers. By the second week of October 2028, the roll call had become easy to verify and hard to argue with. Ben Cooler still operated 480 acres under terms that had rebuilt his working capital and his confidence without returning him to the same leveraged trap. Maria and Nate Iverson still ran 300 acres. Machinery debt still at zero. Reserves current. Marriage steadier than it had been during the note-heavy years that had nearly broken both the farm and their household. Eli Stenson still farmed his 80 acres, still followed lower input rotations, and still posted profits that were modest in absolute dollars and profound in context. Carl Nessen, the neighbor whose auction had shaped a 14-year-old boy in 1986, had passed away years earlier, but his family line remained in the county through a daughter who leased ground locally. Travis sent a quiet annual gift from his personal giving line to the church repair fund Carl once maintained, never naming why. The elderly couple Randy had followed into the cooperative office that morning in Cuck 2024 remained in their home place under a reduced acreage lease to a nephew. They were not central to county headlines. They were central to what continuity looked like. Travis's own status changed least on the surface and most underneath. He still drove the 1994 Ford F-250, now with 326,000 miles in the same stubborn tailgate. He still wore work coats with patched elbows and kept household spending close to the same disciplined band, adjusted only for ordinary inflation and health costs. The 1978 International Harvester 1486 still ran after another winter of deliberate maintenance. The 1991 Combine still worked through harvest, with repair logs updated on index cards from a coffee tin that had outlasted several local dealerships. The farm still operated. The ledgers still expanded one line at a time. The reserve rules he had written for himself became contract language for others, then fund policy for first-generation operators, then cooperative templates, discussed in rooms where new pickups still parked beside old trucks, and appearance still tempted people into quick conclusions. If you are still here, subscribe for more full-record farm stories where numbers, not noise, decide the ending. Then comment with one specific rule you would put in your own operation tomorrow. Reserve per acre, debt service cap, or payment deferral trigger. Share this with the one person you know who looks at a patched coat and assumes weakness, because this county now repeats one settled fact without irony. The farmer who looked porous built the strongest balance sheet and then used it to keep other farms alive. At dusk, after a long day of cutting and carting, Travis shut down the combine, listened to the engine tick as it cooled, and watched the yard lights come on one by one across buildings that had never needed to impress anyone. The old Ford sat near the shed, rust along the fenders, mud on the rocker panels, paid for. The ledger waited on the kitchen table under yellow light. Outside, wind moved across stubble and into next season's ground. Inside, the columns remained the same: required, optional, deferred. And now on pages that carried more than his own name, reserve first. He closed the ledger, capped his pen, and opened the fireproof cabinet by the pantry door. The manila folder from the auction went to the left tray, behind deed copies and wire confirmations stamped 342. The unsigned 2024 renewal packet Randy had circled in red went to the right tray, clipped to the first page of the new risk protocol the county board adopted in April. Beside both stacks sat the coffee tin of index cards for the 1978 International and the 1991 Combine, each card dated, each repair cost written in block print. None of it looked dramatic. It looked organized. That was the point. On April 30th, 2025, Ben Keller parked at the cooperative office at 7:15 with his first quarter reserve receipt in hand and asked the treasurer to verify posting before he loaded seed. The deposit was $4,200, exactly 1/4 of his annual $16,800 requirement. At 8:40, he prepaid one fertilizer tranche on 10-day terms and saved $2,940 in finance charges, compared with the 12-month operating note offered across the counter. He kept a photocopy of both quotes in his pickup door pocket. That summer, when a neighbor asked why he was so strict about dates, Ben answered in 5 words. Dates decide who owns harvest. By the first week of November 2025, his 480-acre statement showed gross crop revenue of $579,360, total operating cost of $421,980, and year-end working capital positive by $112,400 after full reserve funding. He sat at Travis's kitchen table with muddy cuffs and a calmer voice than he had carried in February. Travis reviewed the numbers, tapped the reserve line once, and said, "Same order next year." Ben nodded. No speech, no performance. In December 2026, cooperative audits recorded his working capital ratio at 1.42, the same figure that had seemed unreachable 20 months earlier. Maria and Nate Iverson's scene was quieter and harder won. On July 12, 2025, they met their mechanic at sunrise, not to sign a loan, but to decide which 2 older implements to refurbish with cash. Budget ceiling, $18,600. They spent $17,940 and logged every receipt. In September, when basis briefly improved, they sold corn in 2 tranches instead of 1 forced move and gained a net 46 cents per bushel after storage and hauling. The gain covered more than half their annual reserve requirement by itself. On January 6, 2026, Maria made their 4th reserve deposit, $2,625, then wrote the account balance on a sticky note and pressed it to the refrigerator door. $10,500 complete. Nate took longer to trust a balance sheet without monthly machinery notes. In March 2026, he called Travis from the parts counter and asked if he could finance a higher horsepower tractor package. Travis asked for one thing: run the stress sheet first. Nate drove to the cooperative, ran the 2 adverse scenario model Randy's office now required, and returned 40 minutes later with a different answer. He rebuilt their existing unit for $21,300 cash. By the close of 2026, their machinery debt was 0, reserve current, and their retained earnings were positive for a second straight cycle. They had not become flashy. They had become durable. Eli Stenson's path moved in smaller numbers and deeper relief. In August 2025, he stood beside 80 acres of lower input rotation and watched a stand that was not perfect, but was profitable at his cost structure. His reserve deposits ran $700 each quarter. He paid each one from operating cash, then used winter welding income for household margin instead of plugging farm debt holes, because there were no monthly machinery claims left to plug. At year-end, he carried a modest surplus, then repeated it in 2026 with a larger cushion. On February 3rd, 2027, Eli returned to Travis's table with a legal envelope and set it down without opening it. "Discharge complete," he said. Travis handed him a new document from the Harmon Field Reserve Fund, a zero-interest emergency note for $28,000 to install drainage improvements that would lower sequence risk on his light ground. Eli read the covenant line twice: reserve contribution first, expansion second. He smiled for the first time in months and said, "I know this rule now." By harvest 2027, he repaid $9,400 of that note and remained current on all terms. The multiplier became visible in county books by mid-2028. Ben's 480 acres, the Iversons' 300, and Eli's 80 totaled 860 acres, stabilized under lease-to-own structures at 3.00%, simple interest, with deferred first-year payments. The Harmon Field Reserve Fund added 12 first-generation operations across 3,760 acres, $684,000 in zero-interest notes, and a 100% on-time repayment record through the first 18 months. Combined acreage retained in family production reached 4,620. At a conservative $5,200 per acre regional valuation, that land base represented $24,024,000 protected from distress transfer. One man's reserve discipline had turned into a county-level risk framework with measurable output. Randy Pike's final arc happened in public, then settled into routine. At the January 2028 winter workshop, he stood in front of 39 producers and held up two packets, one old, one new. The old packet was policy tier heavy, thin on debt stress. The new packet began with a debt service table, two adverse scenarios, and reserve coverage months before premium options appeared. He looked directly at the back row where younger agents sat and said, "Coverage is a tool. Structure is the foundation. Sell tools after you check the foundation." No one applauded. They wrote that sentence down. He retired in October 2028 at the County Extension Hall, coffee urn steaming in the same corner, where he once gave polished sales pitches. His closing remarks were not defensive. "I was trained to optimize claims outcomes," he said. "I should have weighted debt timing risk earlier. Travis Harmon forced a better model into this county, and he did it with records, not arguments." After the meeting, he shook Travis's hand at the door and added quietly, "I should have listened sooner." Travis answered, "You changed. That matters." Randy moved to Sioux Falls, consulted part-time on risk modeling for new agents, and by spring 2029, his training modules required debt service stress testing before high coverage recommendations in 3 surrounding counties. By the second week of October 2029, the renewal room looked familiar and not the same. New pickups still lined the front row. Travis's 1994 Ford, now at 331,000 miles, still needed that shoulder bump on the tailgate. But the agenda had changed. Reserve per acre planning appeared before premium elections. Cash flow stress sheets were submitted with acreage intentions. 2 operators who had once watched Travis at the cooperative counter with quiet disbelief now asked him for his quarterly reserve calendar template. He handed them copies and said, "Keep dates first." Every named life found a settled place. Ben Kohler still farmed 480 acres, reserve current, ratio strong, and no return to the old leverage stack. Maria and Nate Iverson still ran 300 acres with zero machinery debt and staged marketing restored. Their arguments shifted from monthly payment pressure to ordinary farm decisions, which felt like peace. Eli Stenson still operated his 80 acres, repaid his emergency note on schedule, and trained 2 younger growers on low-input margin floors each winter. Randy Pike lived in retirement, with a corrected professional legacy rather than a defended mistake. Carl Nesson remained gone, but his daughter continued leasing local ground, and the church repair fund he once kept received an anonymous annual gift that everyone understood and nobody announced. The elderly couple from the cooperative doorway stayed on their home place under the nephew's lease and attended every fall supper. Travis changed least in appearance and most in reach. Household spending stayed within disciplined bands. The 1978 International Harvester 1486 still ran after another winter rebuild. The 1991 Combine still harvested, with repair logs updated on index cards that moved from coffee tin to file box when the stack grew too thick. The fireproof cabinet now held more than his own papers. Signed reserve confirmations from Ben, the Iversons, and Eli. Fund repayment ledgers. Board minutes documenting the county protocol shift. And the old red-circled policy packet that had started an argument the county no longer needed to repeat. At dusk on a cold evening in November 2029, he shut down the combine, walked to the house, and placed that day's receipts under the yellow kitchen light. Wind moved through cut stubble. The Ford cooled in the yard with metal ticks and rust along the fenders. He opened the ledger to a clean line and wrote 4 column headers that had outlasted rates, weather, and opinion. Required, optional, deferred, reserve first. That was the whole thesis after all the noise. Appearance had always been the least reliable metric in the room. The patched coat hid liquidity. The old truck hid patience. The quiet farmer, who looked undercapitalized, had built a $12,740,000 balance sheet without borrowing against tomorrow's weather, then used that strength to keep 4,620 acres in family hands. Debt had not been a moral failure. It had been a structural risk often priced too cheaply in good years and paid for brutally in bad ones. Discipline had looked slow until crisis made speed irrelevant. Arithmetic settled what reputation could not. The farmer who looked poorest built the strongest balance sheet and then made it portable so other people could survive their own hard seasons.